I live down the road from Harrop-Procter Community Forest. We share the lake. And I happen to know how much effort that Erik, as the manager there, has put into really doing a lot of work on climate change adaptation for their community forest. And then I got the idea one night late that I should just reach out to Roly Russell and see if he would be available to moderate the session. So every once in a while, a person gets to have it all in one session. So that's what's working for me here today. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Roly Russell. Roly was elected the MLA for Boundary-Similkameen in the 2020 provincial general election. And Roly, he serves as the Parliamentary Secretary for Rural Development under the Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Development, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. He was born and raised in rural Grand Forks, and he still calls that place home. Before running for provincial office, he served as the elected leader in the Kootenay Boundary region in the regional district and was on the Association of Kootenay Boundary Local Governments, chaired the local credit union board, and was a member of the executive of the Union of BC Municipalities. And we all remember that year in 2018 when Grand Forks was hit really hard by the flooding. And Roly helped lead that response of the community by coordinating with all the emergency operations and facilitated communication between different levels of government to make sure that the needed assistance was there. And through that flooding response, he helped to establish a new model of community-led disaster recovery. Roly has a PhD in ecology, which is really why he was picked to lead this session. His science focused on biodiversity and sustainability, including decision-making under those factors of uncertainty, such as climate change. And he also has been a farmer or operated his own organic farm and co-founded an agricultural society and sat on the board of the Certified Organic Association of BC. So with all of that talent, here he is. I'd like to welcome Roly Russell to take over the mic, and let's go into the session. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. That was a lot of kind words there. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's genuinely really an honor to be here. I certainly share a passion with, I think, a lot of you all in terms of community forests and really supporting local communities and First Nations having a seat at the table in terms of, or running the table for that matter, in terms of making decisions in our forests. And so it really is a genuine honor to be here. I love what you do. I'm joining you today from Victoria, which you can probably tell by the outfit and the location. It's a pleasure to be here on the Lekwungen territory, the Songhees and Esquimalt, to be zooming in with you all. I had a great conversation with Erik yesterday. Erik and I have crossed paths a few times before, and I think you probably all have his bio, and he's probably a familiar face to many of you, given his role as a forestry consultant, as well as the manager of Harrop-Procter Community Forest, and his past role on the board and as president for the association. So I decided I wouldn't spend a bunch of time with his blessing. I wouldn't spend a bunch of time rehashing that bio, but instead, just a little focus on maybe what his vision is going forward and some of the more forward-looking pieces. And the part that I think that we're really lucky to have him here with this presentation is around, again, something I think probably a lot of us in very different fields have struggled with, is that bridging between what is theory and what we we understand may be the case in a theoretical world versus what is practice on the ground. And especially in the world that we're in, and the concern we know we have around climate change and climate action and managing our forests, how do we bridge that gap? How do we integrate some of the climate science and the risk theory and translate that into actual on the ground practice. And so I think we're all pretty happy to be here, and Erik, I think, has some exciting stuff to present to us, and you're here to listen to him, and I hope it's great, and I will turn it right back over to you, Erik.
I'm the manager for the Harrop-Procter Community Forest. I have been for 15 years, long enough to see the climate changing and fires and whatnot, and I just want to speak a bit about work we've been doing for about the past 5 years. Here is the Harrop-Procter Community Forest. That's Kootenay Lake, as you can see, and Nelson in the bottom left, Balfour right north of the community forest. About 11,300 hectares. And we go right from, not quite from the lake, but almost lake level in a few places, although there is a lot of private land, right up to the top of the mountains. Last peak is around 2,300 meters. We're very fortunate in our community forest to have contiguous entire watersheds in the community forest, with the exception of private land right at the bottom. And we have mostly mature 100, I just changed my slide to 110-year-old mixed forest because they're all from the turn of the century, primarily the last century. And with 70 years of fire exclusion under our belts, we have a very green carpet of trees, or did have. That photo was taken about 20 years ago, view over Sunshine Bay near Proctor. A few things have happened. 2003, big fire year, of course, 7,000 hectare fire in Kettle Creek burned into the upper reaches of Harrop Creek. That's the view of Harrop Creek with the 2003 wildfire on the left and the 2017 wildfire on the right. About half of the headwaters of Harrop Creek was burned up. A bunch of Narrows Creek was burned up, and the community was on evacuation alert for the second time in 20 years for a number of weeks. That's just a preview. Just very briefly, the co-op that I work for, it is a cooperative. There are a few community forests that are incorporated as cooperatives, including the Silviculture Community Forest just around the corner from me, who I also consult with. There's over 200 members who own the community forest. They're all residents of Harrop-Procter. We've been around for over 20 years. Second community forest awarded in the province. And the objectives 20 years ago were shorter than they are now. 20 years ago was water protection, and employment. And water protection is often a surrogate for broadly ecosystem-based forestry in our area. Since 2003, community wildfire protection has been, for obvious reason, a major focus, and climate change adaptation became officially part of our management plan and community discussion around 2010, 2011, and was written into our management plan in 2012. So I've been working on it since then. So, and this is what Roly said. The project is here because there's a ton of work that's been done and a lot of talk and theory about climate change adaptation, but there is not a whole lot of sort of systematic action on the ground. And I hear this from ecologists, from even government folks. There's just a disconnect. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fire hose of information and the fact that we can't drink from a fire hose and as managers, and that we don't have many examples to sort of make it real for us. So our community forests put ourselves forward as folks who are interested in trying a pilot study of what it would look like to run a community forest, to manage a community forest through the lens of climate change. Of course, it's through many other lenses as well, and share our learnings. So that's what I'm doing right now with you, and then there'll be more learnings to be shared over the next few months. So this is just a taste of it. Like I say, it's been 5 years that I've been working on this. Through our funding from CBT funded 2/3 of the project, and our community forest funded 1/3. CBT is very interested in outreach across the Columbia Basin, and I would say even broader than that. So we have an advisory committee that's quite regional in focus. I'm not going to run through everyone who's on the advisory committee, but I'll I'll just point out that we have a regional ecologist, Deb McKillop. We have forestry staff. We have representatives from large industry, medium-sized industry, and small industry. 3 or 4 ATCO and the Silviculture Community Forest. And we have a couple of very good ecologists, Rachel Holt, who's a neighbor of mine in Nelson, who's now been appointed to the Old Growth Technical Advisory Committee, I believe that's what it's called. And Cindy Pierce, who's a great communicator and forester in Revelstoke, who's worked on these files for many years. Also, Brendan Wilson from Selkirk College, Mike Drinkwater, who's a forester and is on our board of the co-op. And we've had Tim Hicks and Brianna Burley from CVT also on our advisory committee, supporting myself and the community forest on this project. Okay, 3 premises to the project, real briefly. One is we already have enough science to get going. I think there's a lot made of the uncertainty and the future orientation of climate change, but this graph here just is a reminder that over the past 100 years, we've already seen major increases in temperatures. These are average temperatures in the central Kootenays. I'm not going to dwell on the graphs because I'm assuming everyone has seen many such graphs. I find this one extremely revealing and a bit alarming. This is water flows in Redfish Creek in the West Arm. April flows over the past 40 years or so, 50 years, are up 73%. September flows are down 42%. That speaks to the changing climate in very important ways in terms of domestic water, agriculture, fish, you name it. So I'm working on these premises here that are very strongly supported in the science. Fall, winter, and spring will be warmer, already are warmer, and are very likely to be wetter on average, like the rain we're getting today. However, summers will be likely even warmer on average than the rest of the season, and up to 30% drier. Even if they're not any drier, simply that change in temperature, the evapotranspiration differences are huge. That leads to 5 to 15 plus times more average annual area burned. I've actually seen 5 to 50 times more average annual area burned. Won't dwell on that. We're all well aware of those issues. And extreme precipitation events are also, there's more energy in the atmosphere, so we can expect more extreme events in general, in terms of wind, in terms of rain. Second premise, we already have enough high-level direction for this work. Provincially, regionally, every district has a plan. The Kootenay Boundary region has a very good extension note from 2016 talking about adapting to climate change. The ecologists have spoken, the smart people have spoken, the managers need to jump in. So here's the project sort of in a nutshell. On the left-hand side, you'll see the general direction that we've been given. Many of us, this would be Southern Interior specific in terms of the dry sites aspects. But on the left, you see the general direction. On the right, you see what our community forest is trying to decide to do in terms of that direction. So if you're partial cutting dry sites, well, which dry sites? How are we going to do it? You know, if we're going to update our stalking standards, well, what are the stalking standards going to be? Where are we going to put our reserves? That kind of thing. So we want to go from the general to the specific in this project. Third premise, the values that we're managing for haven't changed all that much. We're still trying to do the same things that we've been doing for a number of years. Climate change doesn't change the values that we're managing for. It just changes the risks and how we try to meet those values. So 3 main steps in the project: a risk assessment, which is about prioritizing our management. Where do we focus? It's like a fire hose information and a fire hose of like, there's so much going to change. What do we do? It can be paralyzing. So first we need to, in order to, in a structured way, look at our priorities, we need to look at where the risks are specifically. Then we have a strategy on operations, which is much more like the nuts and bolts of the how do we change our management on specific sites that are at high risk. And then management plan and AAC implications. Does this affect our cut level? How fast do we want to adapt? So I'll do a bunch of slides on risk assessment here. Again, this is about prioritization. It's about what goes to the top of the list in terms of risk. Really briefly, this is using the standard risk definition of probability times consequence, which most foresters and managers will be aware of. And we specifically looked at the probabilities of fire and drought and the consequences to those four values that the community holds most dear: homes and infrastructure, especially in regards to fire, water, biodiversity, and timber. And that'll all become evident as I run through this briefly here. This slide, most people probably don't like it. I don't even know if I really like it, even though I made it, but a few people say they really like it. So I think it just gets you on the left-hand side, you're going from the value itself, and then you see the risk to the value, or the element of the value and where the risk comes from. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but if someone really likes it, they can get it later. This just shows the logic of the risk assessment. There's no risk without a value that we care about. So I'm going to run through some of our mapping of our values, or the areas that matter to us. Timber values, that's an easy one. We've got a THLB, timber harvesting land base. Some of those areas are more valuable than others. Some have better access. So if you just map those based on a few basic metrics, you can get a high, medium, low consequence to timber value. Water value in our part of the world, on the other hand, tends to be higher elevations, the areas that snow melts the latest, and contribute to, when they contribute to the peak flows, we really get high peak flows. And when they don't have any water left in them, we don't have much in August, September. Riparian area is also super important. So the risk to timber and the risk to water might be in very different locations on our land base. And it's important not to try to mush all those values together. Okay, probability. So that was the consequence side. Probability, fire and drought. The key ecological concept that I've been using in this, with direction from provincial and regional ecologists, is to look at actual soil moisture regime. This is based on how dry a site gets in the summer, not in November, but in the summer primarily. And we've mapped it for our community forest based on our terrestrial ecosystem mapping. Just to really briefly explain it, absolute soil moisture, or actual soil moisture, is based on cumulative water moisture deficits. So how much access to moisture does vegetation have in the summer? So we have long deficits all the way up to short deficits or no deficits. This is you don't need to look at this whole slide, but just look at where I put the circles here. Here's the climate change shift. So in my red dot here, so we've got the past climate, which is the reference climate. It's already not the climate we have. In a average site in the ICH DW, we were sort of middle of the road as far as moisture. 4 is sort of average, as the color coding suggests. The future moisture regime that we're looking at is a step and a half drier. Okay, if we look down at towards the top of the mountain on upper ESSF, it actually doesn't even change very much. So what this slide should tell us is that not all sites get drier at the same rate. It's the sites that are already dry that are going to get more dry by quite a bit. And the sites that are currently relatively moist are much more likely to not change that much. Real quick here, so here's our community forest. Blue is wet and red is dry. here's our past climate, here's the climate we're heading into in a decade or two, and here's the climate a couple decades later. So this is straight out of the science. This is how we can look at our land base, regardless of what subzone it's in. It's all been equalized for drought stress. So that's 1990, 2055, 2085 climates. And this is using all the 17 or 18 global circulation models as vetted by the provincial ecologists and the regional ecologists for our area. This is all from them. This is very straightforward information. So drought matters what species we're talking about. You can see here, if we just take, this is a regular typical mesic site in the lower elevations. Each species has a different drought tolerance, as we all know from our silviculture classes many years ago. And take a pine tree, for example. In the current climate on this site, it might be in the moderate risk zone. In the future climate, as we push down to a drier soil moisture regime, we might fall off the bottom of the scale. So each tree species has a different tolerance to drought. And so what we did is we took our VRI, our forest cover data, and we grouped our species by drought tolerance. So fir and Ponderosa pine leading stands are the most drought tolerant, and spruce balsam would be least drought tolerant. So it's quite easy to classify your stands according to their drought tolerance based on the percentage of different species. So that's what we did within the limitations of what VRI gives us. There's our type group. So drought probability of on our land base in the past climate, not too alarming. 2055, 2085, it's pretty straightforward. There aren't many sites left that aren't at moderate to high. There's basically no sites available that aren't at moderate to high drought. So that means the species that we have on the land now are, to a very large extent, unsuited to the climate. However, it's not the same everywhere. We have some areas that are much higher risk than others. Okay, fire, that was drought. Fire probability, we're looking at the likelihood of high severity fire. We did not use the provincial algorithm because it was not useful. For us, it just doesn't work for the Kootenays. I won't get into the details of how we did it because there isn't time right now, but I'll just show you. Basically, our probabilities of fire are already very high because of our 110-year-old forests and lack of fire. The only areas where they're low is the areas that already burned in the past 20 years, which you're seeing down here in the bottom left corner. So high intensity fire probabilities, past climate, future climate, pretty scary, no surprises there. So back to the probability times consequence concept. So we've looked at probability, we've looked at consequence, you put them together, and now we can look at risk to timber, which is not just where the timber value is, but where is their timber value where the trees are at imminent risk of becoming drought stressed. Quite alarming that most of our land base says it doesn't have a lot of cedar in it. Most of our land base at low elevation does have cedar in it. It doesn't say so in the VRI. So as we get to know our land base better, we find out it's actually more and more at risk compared to what we thought. So there's timber risk. Of course, it gets higher in 2085 based on increased probability of drought. Biodiversity, we haven't talked about that, but we looked at where our old forests are located and our rare sites and which are most at risk based on the climate. Most of our sites get more at risk over the future. Here we go backwards and forwards again. I'm going to jump to the very last slide here on our risk assessment. This is a summary where we have mashed together all of the values together, timber, water, biodiversity, and homes. And red means high risk and blue means not high risk. Basically, most of our low elevations are at the highest risk, and our high elevations much less so. That's a key finding. Don't worry too much about the high elevations, relatively speaking. In any case, we can't do much about them in our land base. Okay, this is it. We're into a triage situation here as far as climate change goes. Like, we're in a very busy emergency room. Stands are going to be coming in, hurt to various degrees by the climate, and we need to prioritize what we're going to do. So each of the different value areas have a different risk area associated with them. So like in the water, it's the high headwater areas. In the homes, it's the low elevation areas. It was very interesting to see through the absolute soil moisture that at low elevations, the drought, the speed at which the drought levels increase is significantly higher than it is at higher elevations. That's primarily due to the nature of our climate and of the changing climate. And another point is that our granitic valley, one of them is Harrop Creek, and Narrows Creek, same elevation, same aspect, but slightly more silt in Narrows Creek, leads to a significant lower drought risk and significantly lower risk overall. So there's a shout out to the value of real on the grounds knowledge of our land base. And basically, we're not going to focus on Narrows Creek very much, except right down by homes. We're going to focus on Harrop Creek because it's higher risk. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? I think it's important to look at two different concepts. One is resisting change, and the other is to realign our management to actively adapt to the change and to transition actively. So if we look at interface treatments, when we look at the fuels aspect, that's resisting because we're trying to keep the fire from getting too bad. But if we look at changing the stand composition and structure, that's more of a realignment. If we're trying to protect old forests and riparian areas from burning down, that's resisting. When we manage a forest actively and plant different species, that's realigning. Caribou habitat's a classic example of where we're looking to resist so that we don't lose the last few caribou. But it's a very different strategy on a dry site where you're looking to realign. We have to think about the carbon carrying capacity of our landscape. Peak carbon on our landscape across, I'd say the whole southern interior probably, and central interior, was reached around June 2003, just as mountain pine beetle was coming in and the big fires came. We've been declining the amount of carbon on our land base has been declining for almost 20 years already. So we're looking at a managed transition here, away from a high carbon density landscape, whether we like it or not. So here's one site here where we're going to resist. This is old growth cedar that already survived a ground fire. Lots of carbon there, moist site. It's actually feasible to try to resist change and keep fire out. On the lower site, more of a drier site, fir larch, cedar hemlock, we're realigning it actively to change, to work with the climate as it comes and taking out the cedar hemlock and leaving the fir larch, spacing it out. Our land base, unlike perhaps some others in, say, the central interior, most of it is in reserves, whether it's caribou habitat, not operable, not productive, steep slopes, that sort of thing. So we have to keep that in context for us. Despite having only 30 to 40% of the land base that we work on, this is sort of my main work plan for the next 5 to 10 years, and for the past 5 to 10 years, is to develop a network of fuel treatments, both in the WUI and at the landscape level. You can see the big blobs there are past fires. Here's the 2003 fire, which is much, much bigger than is shown on the screen, and the 2017 fire, which touches it as well. And all of these little purple dots are human-caused ignitions that have been recorded by the Wildfire Service, and all the red dots are lightning-caused ignitions that have been recorded. I would guess that there have been significantly more lightning fires, especially in the 60s and 70s, than that are recorded here. But just a reminder that we have lightning fires starting all over the land base all the time. This is just a zoom in here. The point being that we have a plan for landscape level fuel breaks like so, and machine guards and hand guards as well. Then we're in the middle of this process. So this is pretty straightforward. Tom in his talk about the Stalking Community Forest yesterday and their fire mentioned how there was a whole bunch of roads that got opened real fast when that fire hit. After our 2017 fire, we looked at our land base and said, well, there's the old road that goes up to the ridge in Procter Creek. Why don't we reopen it now? Because one day we're going to need that. So that's what we did. We got a road permit on this non-status road and we reopened it and we brushed it out and we put in a helipad at the top so that we're ready for the next fire. This is all a simple fire resistance strategy. The green line there is guard that we built on Labor Day weekend in 2017 and is still in place. So we have permanent guards already built around the community. And I was also asked by the wildfire folks to lay out an emergency guard in people's backyards. The green line is mostly on the community forest. The yellow line is entirely on private land. So we've got guards already constructed thanks to 2017. Here's what a couple of them look like. They're just simple machine guards in defensible spaces where you can run a hose, that sort of thing. You can see here, that's one of our fire guards there from 2017 that they were able to back burn off of and contain the fires spread to the north. Also on this, and in the background, of course, there's the 2003 fire and the 2017 fire. In the foreground, you can see one of our landscape level fuel breaks that we've built in Harrop Creek. It's about 150 meters wide. We did this in 2009 because this is the only defensible space. Again, Tom Bradley, talking about CIFCO's fire, they had a fire guard right at the top of that one ridge there that ended up holding. And that was just a guard. It didn't even have any width to it, I don't think. Imagine if they had 150 meters to work with at low fuels. When that fire came. These guards require maintenance. It's already been more than 10 years since we put in that guard and we were out there brushing or spacing, I should say. We're trying to keep the conifer levels down on that guard permanently. Connectivity of treatments. This is the managed forest just north of that guard. We are working on the opposite of the government rules around adjacency and not putting blocks beside each other. We purposefully try to put our units beside each other for the reason that from a fire perspective and even from a connectivity of resilient forest perspective, we want that. Permanent access, we already have designated crossings put in from of creeks. And you can see this green line where the defensible spot between East and West Harrop Creek is the creek itself backed up with a fuel-free zone with a permanent skid rail up the middle of it in that yellow zone. Okay, that was all sort of resistance-based adaptation to climate change, mostly fire. Now I'm going to talk about the more challenging stuff, which is more thinking about realigning the forest. So here, the main shot is a very dense, low elevation forest, very typical for us. You can see the fir tree with the paint on it, which I designated to retain. The rest of it is cedar and hemlock on a dry site. This is our absolute soil moisture regime. We're probably in the orange zone here and headed towards the red zone in terms of fire moisture, right in the interface. So we have to consider realigning this site. It's just not suited even to the current climate, let alone the future climate, especially given it's right beside houses. So there's one of our realignment tools there. Hoe chucking in that forest, that is the exact same forest. That's the before and that's the after in the upper photo. Lower photo just after harvesting. This is all conventional equipment, but pre-fuel cleanup. This is the site nearby where we took the Minister of Forests last week. We want to think about realigning these drought-prone sites. So here's just one example. So ICH DW1 104, so that's a very typical site for us, slightly drier at low elevations. We've developed a series of desired future conditions or ranges for it, and we're building targets for how much of this type of forest do we want to address in the next 20 years. This is a slide from Winlaw Creek prescribed fire on a very dry site, reintroducing fire. At landscape level, this was a helicopter ignition of several hundred hectares on a dry south-facing slope to prevent ingress primarily. Okay, on the bottom you can see the same low elevation site in Harrop Creek that we were looking at a couple slides ago. It's going from moderately dry to more like very dry in the future, and this is the future forest condition that we're looking for on that site. Widely spaced Douglas fir, larch, and deciduous. The cedar hemlock has been cut out of it. The ground fuels and the ladder fuels have been largely removed. This is a more open site. Why is it more open? Well, it's one step drier. So it's going, it started a little drier and it's getting even drier again. So here's perhaps a desired future condition for a 103 site instead of a 104 site, just a little bit drier. Stalking standards. I've been involved with others in writing new fire management stalking standards. There's both a partial cut standard and an even age regen standard. We are using selective harvesting equipment this year for the first time. We had access to this kind of cut to length harvester equipment. Fellow bunchers can do an amazing job partial cutting, but they do have their limits. So we're also looking at other equipment to do this partial cutting. This is a site, at the upper left is what the stand looked like just outside of Nelson in West Arm Park. Before treatment, we removed all of the dead down pine and the cedar understory, and then we underburned it in the past couple of years to try to get towards more of a sustainable stand, more adapted to climate change. Stalking standards again, here's an example. I think this is actually Winlaw Creek again. Great submesic drier site for Ponderosa Pine. Just some of the metrics about how much volume was removed and what our target canopy closure was in that site. Not all stands have great fir and larch to work with. Some of the stands look like that one in the top right there. Mostly cedar hemlock grand fir, not many good bones, as it were, of climate adapted species. We have to look at realigning those sites and converting them. So we have stalking standards also for that. They're lower density and they encourage the use of such things as Ponderosa Pine and Doug fir and larch. And these are a few Ponderosa Pine. We started planting Ponderosa Pine about 10 years ago because we didn't have a whole ton of it in the land base. It's native, but underrepresented due to fire exclusion. And we're planting it. We're planting provinces that are from slightly drier and warmer climates than ours, so that we're working on that shift as well. We also have a research site for climate change research in the community forest. That's Suzanne Simard there with some of her team from a couple summers ago. We are just participating in the project. It has 20 different sites probably around the province. Point being, we're looking at how important are the overstory trees in a changing climate. Obviously there's shade factors, but there's also mycorrhizal factors, that sort of thing. Since Suzanne's work is in the news a lot, I thought I'd include that little fact there. There's lots of research that we can join in on. Very briefly, last thing I'm going to talk about here is hydrological modeling. This is information, this is a study just completed a couple weeks ago that looked at stream flows in our main creeks. We have 20 years of water monitoring data that the community has collected, the community forest has paid for and collected. You can see at the top here The blue dots are all data collection points on stream flows. And we use some fairly sophisticated modeling tools to calibrate, or we use the real data to calibrate it. So the red is the modeled and the blue is the actual. We got a pretty good match there. And we broke, I say we, the hydrologist broke all of our, here's Harrop Creek. It's got about 50 or 60 different hydrological response units, rather than just talking about above the H60 and below the H60. This is like having 60 different types, because they all melt at different rates and they all contribute to peak flows in different ways and low flows in different ways. Again, busy slide, don't need to focus on it too much, except that we modeled two things. We created the creek flows, a model for that based on our actual observations, and we looked at what climate change was likely to do to that. That's what the blue arrow shows. That's the flows getting shifted. Not surprisingly, earlier in the year, we're looking at more of a hybrid snowmelt and rain-driven hydrograph instead of a straight snowmelt-driven hydrograph. That has implications for management. On the other hand, we looked at what happens if we harvest half of the THLB at low elevation. What happens if we harvest all the high elevation sites? How much does that affect the hydrograph in terms of peak flows and low flows? The initial answers are actually on our land base, not very much, because our timber harvesting land base is so concentrated already at low elevations, which are not the most important areas in terms of our high flows and our low flows. That's all I'll say about that. There's a lot more detail to that, but this is very high level. Management plan and AAC, and this is what we're starting work on now, a final step of the project. Tom and I will be working on some timber supply modeling. Unsalvaged losses. We've had 2 major fires. We're going to have more. What does that mean in terms of our concepts of sustained yield and even flow timber? We already started in 2012 looking at different scenarios of harvest levels. And the biggest driver, very likely on our land base, perhaps not on others, the biggest driver is very likely to be in the amount of timber that's available is going to be the climate, not what we do on our small land base. However, we have a social choice to make about how fast we develop these field breaks. How many of them, how fast, that's constrained by our AAC, which is currently 10,000 meters a year. That could go up, it could go down, depending on the social choices that we make based on a changing climate. Finally, there's an outreach component, the handbook that documents this kind of stuff, the risk assessment, the action plan and the management plan stuff that will be published through this project over the winter. There'll be a workshop that comes with it. And we've also started working on some educational films funded separately through CBT as well that are all about community wildfire protection and the community involvement in that. So look for more if you're interested on the outreach side over the coming months. And that is my very high speed, very high level overview of our project. And thank you for your attention. And I'm hoping we can have a bit of discussion about it.
Awesome stuff. Thank you very much, Erik. That's a lot of material there. So I hope everybody had a chance to digest it. I guess, you know, on that note, the first question, we've got a few questions coming in and I've got a few here, so we'll kind of go back and forth. It's clearly a pretty data intensive effort. And so, you know, for those practitioners that are watching or managers that are watching, do you have a sense of how, you know, can you do this by cutting back the investment by 25% and still get a good value out of the product? Or is it the sort of thing that there really needs a full commitment like this from your perspective to get to a positive outcome?
Because this is a pilot study and because I was working with very good ecologists and we wanted to get our methodology right, especially on the risk assessment, which was the most challenging part of the study of the job. I think we overbuilt our methodology a little bit for a small community forest. It's arguably the risk assessment methodology would make more sense to go through that whole business at a larger landscape level, maybe 100,000 hectares or 50,000 hectares or even more. But there are community forests that size. The basic data layers that we used are not rare. We used VRI, we used our terrestrial ecosystem mapping, which many people have, or at least predictive ecosystem mapping. We used, what else did we use? We didn't have to create any brand new data sets. We used what we had, and that's where the absolute soil moisture regime concept really helps. So I would say that it's very tempting to skip the risk assessment. And it could be that if you know your land base really well, you already know where the high risks are. You could sort of not do a full formal risk assessment. But what the risk assessment in a community discussion perspective does is it helps to, looking back at our education session we had a couple hours ago there, if you're talking, some people, climate change tends to get all the values, all the risks all get put together in one big jumble, and it's kind of overwhelming. If we can tease it, well, where's the fire risk to water? Where is the fire risk to old growth? And focus in on those. The risk assessment helped us do that. So yeah, it looks really data intensive, and for us, there's a lot of fancy maps and specialized custom built algorithms, but it doesn't need to be that complicated.
Great. One of the questions that came in is similar to something I was going to ask, which was around, and you just kind of touched on it too, like the scalability of the model, and the question that was posed by Garnet, which is, do you feel like the risk assessment kind of modeling should and could be scaled up to a larger scale, like the TSA or something like that?
Definitely. I think we, like I was saying, we sort of overbuilt it, but we had to build it that way in order to be rigorous. So definitely the methodology, I don't see the methodology is scale dependent. The only caveat I would put on it is that the local, because the data sets aren't perfect, the local knowledge can't be underestimated. So, we looked at the provincial strategic threat analysis data, and we knew from our direct knowledge and experience of the fire and that it just couldn't be used. So we had to come up with our own. But that's a caveat. Overall, the structure of the risk assessment is totally scalable.
So yeah, that's great. It's scalable, I guess. So part of the question too is, should it be scaled up? And that kind of aligns with the follow-up for myself would be, did you run into, not exactly data gaps, but situations where you felt like the externalities or things beyond your landscape, the landscape you were looking at, you had wished that there was modeling that was including those. So should it be scaled up?
Certainly, all of our management decisions are made in a context of our larger land base, the larger land base of the West Arm of Kootenay Lake. In our particular community forest, we're surrounded on 2 sides or 3 sides by a large park, a lot of which burned, like our community forest did, but is unmanaged. So definitely the fact that there wasn't good data for that landscape, from a forest cover perspective is definitely limiting, and that you're always going to come up against that. If you were doing a larger land base and you're using, we used our LiDAR data to come up with the fuel loading, having pieced together LiDAR for a whole area that's consistent would definitely be an issue. There's always data issues.
Yeah.
We did definitely customize the risk assessment to make it actually be realistic for our land base, and there's professional judgment definitely came into play there.
That makes sense. One of the questions that came in directly was, could you describe a little bit like how much, what's the role of funding sources kind of outside the forest, right? I know you mentioned early on 2/3 of this was, it sounded like was CBT, kind of beyond that. Do you want to speak to that that role of funding?
So funding, external funding for doing the work, certainly in terms of fuel treatments, especially which are, you know, some of the most expensive, as most of us know. We've been quite successful in tapping into provincial programs through Swipe B in the regional district, and through Forest Enhancement Society, and now through WRR and the BCCFA's program through Wildfire Risk Reduction Program. So we've used all of those different programs over the years, as have other community forests, to implement specific chunks of it. I would say that map that I showed of all of the fuel breaks that we would like to build over the next 10 years, of which a third are built and maybe almost a third are slightly in progress and a third aren't done yet. Like having that work already done and paying for that yourself and being ready as soon as the funding becomes available, boom, you can say, okay, we're going to go for this one. And you can rationalize why you want the funding, and you're ready to go, hit the ground running.
That makes a ton of sense. And I guess, you know, building on that, Duncan has asked a question about whether you've considered advocating or investing in more specific protection resources in you know, your resisting versus realigning piece. And so like the heavy infrastructure, basically helicopters and so on.
Right. We haven't like, I know some community forests have their own initial attack crews, for example. We haven't done that. We don't own any firefighting equipment ourselves, although others do, and I think it's a great idea. What we have invested in is pre-building a number of fire guards, so that when the next fire comes, the resources that become available, even if they're extremely limited from the wildfire service, will be able to be used. And we found in our 2017 fire, the only way we were going to get any resources on that fire, because Kelowna was burning right at the same time, the only way we would get any resources is if we developed the access, made it safe, showed them that we had a plan, and got started. And then the resources came in. So first it was just me hanging ribbon and our logging contractor and his son building. And then 3 days later, we got some crews, you know. So we pre-built, and now, you know, that's an emergency situation, pre-building, reopening those roads now, putting in the helipads now. We're investing in that infrastructure right now.
Awesome. Another question that came in a little earlier from Jennifer was, which is good for me to hear your thoughts on, is are you running into forest policy impediments to implementing your plan, and obviously what are they, if they are there, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
We haven't run into any full stop impediments, I would say. We have a very good relationship with our district and with the wildfire folks in the zone and region, and there's a trust there. So I think we've been allowed to do some things that because of that trust. However, there are certain things that slow us down around exemptions required for visual quality objectives, that kind of thing. And I totally understand the rationale for needing to do that. It just can, I know that a lot of innovation gets stifled, not because you can't necessarily do it, but because it seems like too much work to go through all the steps to rationalize it and get everyone on board. So definitely, I would say at a provincial policy level, Stalking Standard focuses on timber that are not necessarily climate change adapted or too timber focused is one. Visuals, old growth management areas have been talked about a lot. You can manage in old growth management areas for those old growth values. So we haven't had that be a barrier for us, but I think in other ecosystems it would be. So yeah, definitely flexibility on a number of these regulatory issues is important. And I have to write quite a few rationales for things like adjacency and visuals, for example. But it can be done. And if you develop the fact that we have a plan and a map and an understanding of why we're doing this that the district and the region already know about really helps get those approvals expedited.
Well, we're going to wind it up here pretty soon, but Susan has given me the go-ahead to push the time a little bit, so maybe 5 more minutes of the questions, and then we'll wrap it up. One of the questions that George asked was whether you will propose your own AAC based on the knowledge, and then he's followed up also just around interest in terms of how this impacts your AAC. And some of the conversation you and I had, which I think is really good, was about the social choices behind what that looks like. So any thoughts there you want to share?
For sure. So we will be doing another timber supply review of our own, using our own model and our own assumptions and sensitivity analyses and all that, just like we did in 2012. And in 2012, we already did do a number of scenarios that we discussed with the community around harvest levels, and we actually decided the community supported a slightly increased AAC in order to do more of this work up front, even knowing that down the road the cut may well go down. It helped that we'd done the work that showed pretty strongly that the cut's going to go down anyways, which isn't so we have to be very careful about the whole timber grab concept. But that being said, even flow, sustained yield is really out of date for a small area based tenure in a changing climate. So yes, we will be proposing a new AAC. It might be higher. I doubt it'll be lower, but the only reason the community would support that is because we've been building trust for 1 or 2 decades, and they know that it's not a timber grab, and also because we're going after the stands that are often the ugliest and most difficult to work with. It's not that we're a lot of this involves going to the most difficult sites, not the easiest ones.
Yeah. Well, we certainly don't have time, but I would love to have more of the conversation around, that trust piece and the social license, and that's why I'm happy to be here talking with a bunch of community foresters. Another question came in from Susan Mulkey, and that is, if you're worried about increased public access and motorized activity in the process of opening up some of those roads.
Yeah, that's definitely a discussion and a concern. In 1 or 2 cases like that, I showed one permanent crossing of a domestic watershed using a whole bunch of logs from 2017. We decided to leave that access in. It is technically access when you look at the crossing, and we discussed it with the landowner, but what we did is we just deactivated, or actually fully rehabbed, a 50-meter section at the front. So the quads and the dirt bikes and stuff can't get in there actually now, but if we had a fire, we could reopen it in 15 minutes. So that's one compromise. The opening up of the road at the top of the ridge, well, yes, that's permanent access, and it doesn't go as far as caribou habitat. If we went into caribou habitat, for example, then we'd have to look at, again, sort of a compromise or a way to not have it negatively impact caribou habitat.
That makes sense. There were a few questions around burn prescriptions, like who is developing them and the role of BC wildfire. And in that process, I think part of that has been answered by Tom, who said the burn prescriptions were developed by yourself with some help from other professionals, and BCWS was developing the planning and the ignition plan. Anything you want to add to the fire piece? Oh, and one of the other aligned questions was around the fire return interval, and if you're tracking the timeline since fires.
On the first question, we worked very closely with the BC Wildfire Service. These were their fires as far as they were the ones using the drip torches. But the burn plan was co-developed between myself, in that case, working for the Stalking Community Forest on that job with the zone folks. And they're very much looking, the fire folks are definitely looking to the land manager. They need approval from the district manager, but from the licensee, they're looking to us for direction as to what we want to achieve, and then they tell us what they think is achievable. And we definitely never tried to come up with a burn boundary ourselves without consulting with the fire folks. So it's very much back and forth iterative process. On the second question of fire return intervals, we're tracking them, but we don't have many. There's not many. We just have, a whole bunch of fires from 110 years ago, and we have a couple fires maybe from the 30s, and then we have 2 big fires recently, and it's not really, our land base is too small to track fire return intervals from a scientific perspective. I do know that some research has been done on the other side of the West Arm, looking at pre-contact or pre-mining era burn cycles, and they were looking at First Nations burning and natural fires burning every 30 to 50 years on a lot of that land base. So I think we can assume that the return intervals are still much longer than they were historically.
Very, very good. Thank you. I'd love to, one of the things that ecologically kind of fascinates me is how, as we see changes on these landscapes in terms of, like you say, like dryness and whatever else, when we see feedback cycles that are out of sync, essentially. So feedback cycles among the pathogens, for example, versus the trees themselves or what have you. So I don't have a set question there, I guess, other than, have you put any thought into that, or is that an issue that you're seeing in your landscape that you feel like is going to be a longer term piece with your model?
Like you're talking about, like where we have positive feedback loops, where there's acceleration, things sort of spiraling because of positive feedback as compared to a negative feedback, or?
Yeah, and I guess also just the scale, the rate of adaptation, and whether you're seeing, some of these climate risks that you're mapping, the scale of adaptation of different aspects of the landscape itself, of the ecosystem, are going to be responding at different rates as well.
Yeah, and that's why we did the risk assessment, to really hone us in on what's the most at risk or most important 5% of our land base, what's in the top 10 or 15%, and knowing that we can't address all of it because that's too overwhelming. So we just picked the ones, and and so we're not going to try to keep a lot of carbon on a site that just can't hold it. We'll just either let it do its own thing, or we'll really reduce it, but we'll just make a call early on and do what we can. One of the reasons we used drought as the sort of driving climate change factor is that, drought obviously contributes to drought stress on trees and direct mortality, but also, of course, it contributes to fire. It also contributes ultimately to the insects. And I found that looking at drought, at least being in the southern interior, drought is the single most important thing that we can look at that will help us make a plan.
That makes a lot of sense. Challenges as we get into these years where we're, flooded, and then heat domes, and then droughts all in the, quick succession in amongst the fires. So, all right. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up there. We're a little bit over time. But I do really appreciate it. It's fascinating. You mentioned carbon in that last answer. There would be a whole other path we could go down, but we probably don't have time for that. So thank you very much, Erik. Appreciate it, and I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Wow. Well, thanks to both of you for a really interesting session and some good questions and dialogue too. It's going to be important for us to have more of this, you call it a pilot, and yet it's the transferability of it all is really important as well. And with thanks, I just want to let you know that a donation has been made on both of your behalf to the Lytton First Nation, whose community was heavily impacted by fires this year. So thank you very much. And thank you. I was a little worried at first because Erik had so many slides if we were going to make it through, but you did really well, Erik. Thank you. Thanks so much, Roly, for your time too.